Good evening, everybody. My name is Chad Stalker. I'm the local history librarian here. Before we get started, I wanted to draw attention to the program surveys that are on your chair. If you could fill those out tonight before you leave, I'd greatly appreciate it. It helps us know how we're doing and lets us know if there's anything that you'd like to see in the future. If you need any writing utensils, we have pencils on the back table. So at the end of the night, you can either give them to me or leave them on the table, and we'll make sure they take a look at them tomorrow. For our upcoming events, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Steve Pettyjohn.
Thanks, Chad, and please fill these out. Chad looks at them, reports back on what we're seeing. This helps us program, and as somebody just pointed out, that's kind of a funny looking screen. But anyways, I would be remiss not to go through the preview of coming attractions. Unfortunately, we don't have popcorn for you to eat while I do this. Coming next month is the Missiles of October, the Cuban Missile Crisis, a kind of a panel discussion led by one of our favorites, Judge William Vaudreuil. He'll be helped out by Judge Ellen Connolly and Frank O'Grady, who you've seen many times as well. And we'll be taking a look at how we didn't blow up the world in October of 1962. In November, we're really excited. We have two people from the Cleveland History Center coming. One many of you saw in, I think, April, Eric Rivette, who did the Before They Were Celebrities presentation. He's coming back along with his colleague, Dr. Mary Manning, and they're going to do the Doughboy experience. We had the GI experience in June, so for November and Veterans Day and Armistice Day, the Doughboy experience, what they went through and how it impacted them. And in December, many of you saw him in January, Ed Chuna is coming back to talk about the road to Pearl Harbor. Okay, so it will be about 2 days before December 7th when that presentation occurs. We're working on next year already, so again, these cards are important for what we may try and do, but we do know, at least at this time, we can tell you what's happening in the first part of the year. In January, Chad is going to talk about the strategic bombing program of World War II, and did it work or not, and was it worth it or not. In February, it's President's Month, and at least at this point, I'm going to talk about my favorite president. I like Ike, okay? And in March, we're going to have, and I'm going to screw this name up, but Grace Padhurst?
Yes,
Ruth. Why do I keep on call her Grace? Pangrace, that's it, okay. Who is part of the Women in History group based in Lakewood, and she's going to help us with an evening with Eleanor Roosevelt on the home front. So that's where we are right now. As you know, sometimes things can change as we get an opportunity to have maybe a veteran in for a specific thing. But that's looking at the next few months. So again, these are important. We look at these and we try and figure out what we want to do. So thank you all for being here and your continued support.
All right, one last thing. Tonight at the World War Forum, it is our pleasure to welcome Andrew Bajda. He wrote the book Captured in Liberation, which tells the story of his father Marion as he escaped Poland at the beginning of the Second World War, trying to flee both the Soviets and then the Germans, and eventually he ends up in Italy, fighting on the side of the Allies, but I don't want to spoil his talk. So without any further ado, I'll turn the microphone over to Andrew Bajda.
Hello everybody, it's a pleasure to be here, and this really takes me back. I raised my family here in Westlake and spent lots of time here at the Porter Library with my girls. I saw Rick Kendall today. He and I were Indian princess, fathers of Indian princesses together. So it really brings back some fond memories. What I'm going to do, first of all, I'd like to ask a question. How many of you in the room are veterans? Wow. Well, first of all, thank you for being here and for everything that you've done. I am not a veteran. My father obviously was. And what I'm going to do today, I'm going to tell two different stories, side by side. First, the story, as was mentioned, is of my father, called Captured in Liberation. And I'm going to talk a little bit, I'm going to talk a lot about his story, but I'm also going to dovetail that with another book some of you may be familiar with called The Trail of Hope. This is a story that was written by Norman Davies. Not a story, it's actually an epic story of the Anders Army. And you see around here, I have a lot of posters of that are from the Polish government. So as I explain the story, you'll begin to understand why I have these posters here, how I got the posters, and how it ties in with my father's story. So let me first get the pictures back up here and show you. This is my father, Marion, and my mother, Iris. This was taken several years after the war in England. My father, after the war, being in the Polish army, was unable to go back to Poland because Poland at that time was under Soviet control. And anybody who went back to Poland wasn't treated very well. So that's why I'm here today. And not in Poland, or, you know, we did leave England. But that's my mother, who is British. And my father, by the way, unfortunately can't be here today only because he's in bed right now. 100 years old. Wow. He used to come to these with me quite frequently, but unavailable right now due to health. His mind is still as sharp as ever, but I can assure you that he is here in spirit. All right. So this story begins on September 3rd, 1939. So you know that date, September 3rd. That was 85 years ago today. My father lived in the southern town of Poland, in a town called Bochnia, which is in the Carpathian foothills, not too far from Krakow. My father had 6 brothers and 1 sister. That's my father on the right. This was taken several years before the war. He was 15 when the war broke out, so he was probably about 11 or 12, I'm guessing 13 when this photo was taken. And when I explain his story, I'm going to talk a lot about a brother of his, Stefan. Stefan is the young man on the left, to the left of their mother. And on September 3rd, my grandfather, he's not in this photo, my grandfather was acting as, in the county, the community that they lived in. He was helping the army. I forget his exact title, but he was involved in the Polish movement to, you know, get troops together to make sure families knew what was going on. So this family of 12 went on a horse-drawn carriage to escape the German invasion. They knew it was coming any day. On September 2nd, Germans invaded several of the buildings in the town of Bochnia. So on September 3rd, 85 years ago, they left on a horse-drawn carriage. It was this group, the driver, 2 cousins, and a neighbor would have made 12 people that all went together on that carriage. And it took them about, I think, 10 days. Well, actually, they were supposed to meet with the convoy. They were supposed to meet with other members, other family members of government officials, but by the time they got to the school to meet everybody, they had all gone. So they were on their own, traveling across the countryside. They could hear the bombings, and they were separated. They just knew they had to go east to get away from the Russians. And my father, the day seemed very much like today, a beautiful day. He said it was a beautiful day. He said that night he laid in that carriage and just couldn't help but look up at the sky because it was shooting stars. It was just a beautiful night. He recalls it as a 15-year-old boy. He was actually excited, like this was some kind of journey. But there was a lot of things that people didn't know. And among them was nobody at that time knew of the secret plot that had taken place between Stalin and Hitler. And that secret plot was to divide and conquer Poland. So they were heading east, thinking they were getting away from danger, but they were actually heading into more danger. I am going to do one reading from my book that kind of is, to me, is amazing, because my father explained that on a Sunday, he explained to me what happened, which I'll read to you. will need my reading glasses here. Okay, this is just one paragraph. Okay. The following morning, 17 September 1939, introduced a frightening image that would remain forever etched in Ian's mind. He ventured out in the early morning, a Sunday, to explore the surrounding countryside. While the village slept, he walked towards a field by the main road where he viewed a solitary soldier surveying the area on horseback. The soldier spotted Ian. My father's name is Marion, they called him Ian. The soldier spotted Ian and eventually approached as close as 15 meters, observing from the saddle of the sturdy Russian Don horse. Ian froze as the two made eye contact, but the Russian soldier made no menacing gesture. He was not concerned with the teenage boy wandering alone in the countryside. The purpose of his mission would soon be revealed. Spotting nobody else in the vicinity, he kicked his horse and with a harsh command sped west past Ian in a westerly direction. The encounter cast a disturbing feeling, but what followed was even more troubling. A tremor. It sent shivers through Ian's entire being. The ground began to shake as a distant rumbling mysteriously blended into the landscape. It started as a low rumble, barely discernible, but grew in intensity as the mounted soldier disappeared beyond the western horizon. Ian could feel the ground shake below him. The vibration increased as the object of the rumbling slowly emerged into view. His heart raced as the column of tanks surfaced, rising above the fog, slowly clearing along the eastern horizon. The line of tanks appeared endless, rolling in single file over the open fields, knocking down fences, trees, anything in sight, right along the same roadway they traveled only days earlier to reach this destination. Ian felt as if he'd been kicked in the gut, a sense of betrayal. He was well aware of the Russian intentions. Poland was once again under attack and now surrounded by enemies from both east and west. So when my father told me that, and he said it was a Sunday, about 10 days after they had left, in doing my research, I realized that sure enough, Russian tanks invaded Poland on September 17th. So I tell my father, you were probably the very first person that saw the Russian tanks entering Poland. And that made for obviously a very difficult situation. So the family, thinking they were safe, now had to go back east, or go back west to try to go back towards Poland. And they ended up in the town of Przemyśl. The reason I use this photo, and by the way, when I did the research for my book, I tried to retrace my father's his steps. I only made it about 6 of the 12 countries, but he was literally all over Europe during the war. But I did manage to go and see a lot of the places where he was. Przemyśl was a Polish city that was divided. There's a river, you can see the bridge. That's the San River. And the San River divided Poland, or divided German and Russian occupation. So my father, they were stuck on the Russian side. They stayed in a monastery as refugees, and they stayed there for about 5 months before they made the very difficult decision to go back to Poland, because you really didn't have a good choice. You know, the choices were very difficult. Without getting into too much detail, about why they ultimately did make that choice to go back to Poland. So that would have been in about April of 1940. By that time, he was 16 years old, so he was forced to do work for the Germans, all right, in a work camp. So I'm going to tell you a little bit now about the other story, the Trail of Hope. And again, you'll see how they all come together. Now, in about March or April of 1940, of course, the Polish army was unexpectedly attacked by the Russians. And so not only was Poland fighting Germany, but now they're also fighting Russia. And 8,000 Polish officers were taken by the Russians and held in a forest called the Katyn Forest, which is in what would now be Belarus. At the time, it was the eastern part of Poland. In addition to the 8,000 officers, there was also policemen, intelligentsia. In total, about 20,000 Poles were arrested in this area around the Katyn Forest. And in the March timeframe, Russia executed all 22,000 of those officers and people. It was kind of hidden. In fact, it was actually even hidden by the United States, because when Russia became our ally, they didn't necessarily want some of that to be known. And for reasons, that should have been shared, we might have made some different decisions had we been more aware of all this. But that 22,000 officers, or 8,000 officers who were murdered, will come into the story as I explain a little bit about the Anders Army. There was one officer who did not go to Katyn, who was not murdered at Katyn. And that is a gentleman named Władysław Anders. Władysław Anders was captured in the southern part by the Russians. And so he was sent to Lubyanka, where he was tortured because, obviously, he was not a friend of the Russians. But he's fortunate that he was not in the Katyn, so he was not murdered. Anders will come on a little bit later on in the story. So just be aware that he is being held in Soviet camps, being tortured in the southern part of Russia. He was not part of the Katyn massacre. Many people, not only soldiers, but families were being sent by the Russians to Siberia for work camps. I don't know if anybody here has ever been to the Polish-American Cultural Center, but Gene Bach, who is a Cleveland, is one of the individuals who was sent to Siberia. My uncle Stefan, who I mentioned earlier, he actually didn't go back with the family to Przemyśl. He wanted to go back to Poland. He thought, I need to get in the fight. I need to get in this fight. I need to join the Polish army. Stefan at that time was 17 years old. Very adventurous spirit. Stefan, as part of his venture, was going south and right around Hungary, what's now Hungary. He was captured by the Russians, tortured. It took them 1 week before he finally signed the papers saying he was a spy. And Stefan and his friend were sent to Siberia, where the temperatures would get as cold as 30, 40, 50 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. There was 5 years of hard labor, which nobody would survive. Nobody survived these 5 years. If by chance you would survive the 5 years, they would just put you right back to work. But they knew nobody was going to survive 5 years. So all the soldiers that were sent to Siberia, these, by the way, are not the officers, but the soldiers sent to Siberia were basically sent there as a death sentence. Tens of thousands of Polish families were also sent to Siberia. They weren't working in camps, but they were put in homes to fend for themselves, where basically they were treated by outcasts by the people in the Russian community. By the way, that's not so much different from what's happening today. You'll note when I mentioned the tanks coming into Poland, which is the land was now Ukraine. We've seen the same thing happen several years ago, and Ukraine families today are being sent to Russian territory. So all this was happening in 1940. And there was hundreds of thousands of families, not in prison, but were sent to Russia, and tens of thousands, if not 100,000 soldiers were working in these camps in Siberia. Now my family didn't know what happened to Stefan. They knew he left. They didn't know that he was in Siberia, and as you'll see, they learned all this much later. At the end of 1941, Germany attacked Russia. So all the deals with Russia and Germany were now null and void. Stalin and Hitler were now enemies. And what happened is Stalin was pretty much forced to release all the Polish prisoners in Siberia, because his thought is they would fight for the Red Army. They would fight against the Germans on the Eastern Front for his Red Army. So my Uncle Stefan, and they didn't find out about it until several months after Germany attacked. They were so far up north that they weren't told anything until one day the commandant came and said, "You're all free to go." Middle of winter, free to go. They had no idea. Go where? Do what? They were given nothing other than, the rags on their back. Somehow or another, they had to try to make their way to the southern part of Russia, in Kazakhstan, where they told an army of Poles is being formed. And because there were no officers, very few, General Anders was promoted by the Polish government in exile, which was in England, and they said, "We want Władysław Anders to be the general of this army." So Russia had to release Anders. Anders was a very bright man. Stalin actually knew him. He did respect him. So Anders was kind of the logical choice to be the general of this ragtag army. So Stefan made his way to Kazakhstan. A lot of Poles did it. He made his way to Kazakhstan to join this army, and they were given, instead of guns, they were given sticks and brooms to go through military drills. They weren't fed properly. And Anders kept saying to Stalin, "Where are my officers?" The numbers kept coming in, more than they ever realized. 80, 90, almost, I think it was 90,000 Polish soldiers made it to from Siberia into Kazakhstan. Many didn't make it, but 90,000 made it, going through these drills, and they thought they were going to have to fight against the Germans on the Eastern Front. But Anders was adamant. He said, "These men aren't being trained. You're lying about my officers. I don't believe you." Stalin told him they escaped to Manchuria. He said, "You're not feeding my men." And so he forced Stalin's hand. Stalin ultimately allowed these soldiers to go under British command, under General Montgomery. So instead of going on the Eastern Front to face the Germans, they instead were transported across the Caspian Sea into Iran, and there they fought in northern Africa. It was a reprieve. They were so fortunate. They went into Russia, or they went into under the British command. They got fresh uniforms, they had food, they had a chance. They had a chance. So that's how, I believe, across the Caspian Sea, I believe Anders took an army of about 90,000 soldiers and also 40,000 civilians. They all squeezed in these boats. And Mr. Bonk, who's a good friend of mine, now lives in Cleveland. He is just one of many people who was part of what they call the Trail of Hope. That gave all these people hope who would have otherwise just perished in Russia. So that army was formed, and it was the Polish Second Corps, which also became known as the Anders Army. And as I'll explain later, they had quite a reputation from their victorious battles. A lot of people don't realize that the Polish army was actually the fourth largest Allied army. It was behind Russia, United States, Britain, and Poland had the fourth largest army, despite the fact they were prisoners. Some had already earlier escaped, into France, where they fought there. But the bulk of the Polish army was these group of men that came from Siberia under the Anders Army. And there is General Anders right there. I believe this is a picture that was taken in Italy, and as I'll see later, after Germany surrendered in northern Africa, then the Polish army across the Mediterranean Sea into Italy, where they were very instrumental in the Italian campaign. And I'll explain a little bit of that later. So with that backdrop, I'll get back to my father's story. So when my father and his family, they made their way without Stefan, they made their way back to Bochnia. And Bochnia looked much different than when they left it. They now, in my grandfather's office, my grandfather was a lawyer. Fortunately, they didn't learn about his activities. They kept low profile. There were Nazi swastika flags hung up on all the government buildings. And they learned that in December of 1939, some young teens murdered or killed 2 of the German police officers. And what Germany did is they were going to take government officials and execute them. But the Red Cross, others convened. They said, you can't do that. Ultimately, they took 50 young men, mostly young men, out of the jails who were in there for trumped up charges. And they dug a trench, and this is in Bosnia, they murdered, shot, and killed 50 young Bosnia men. The two men who killed the police officers were actually hung, strung by their necks in the lamppost on the main square and left there throughout Christmas. So when my father, they came back in April, they learned of all this. It was a very, as you can imagine, a very difficult time to be living back home. Although they chose this because they thought living as a refugee under Russian occupation was even worse. At least here they could be in their own home and try to survive. Another thing that happened while my father was there is that his cousin Tadeusz was involved with a group of young men, and I don't know if they were really planning anything, but they were accused of planning atrocities against some of the German officers, and just like that, he and his buddies were all sent to Auschwitz. I happened to come upon this photo when I was going through all the pictures in my cousin's house, who lives where my father actually grew up. And when I shared, if anybody knew who this was, nobody knew, but when I brought it back, my father knew right away, that's Tadeusz. Tadeusz was sent to Auschwitz. And by the number he has there, he was one of the earlier arrivals in Auschwitz. And he only lived for about 6 months before he did perish in Auschwitz. So as you can imagine, very difficult time. Several years later, it was about 1942, 1943, by this time America's in the war, and my father and his family, they all kept a very low profile. He was now from the work camp, he was home, and now he was sent to Austria. And my father was sent to a butcher's farm in Austria, in a town not too far from Vienna called Weickendorf. And in my travels, I went to the house where my father was held. I knocked on the door, I had the address, and that little girl you see right there, her name is Anna Schuster. Her father there is Otto Schuster. He was a Nazi sympathizer who owned the butcher shop. So my father and others were working, preparing food for the German army. So Anna, the little girl there, my father remembers her as a little girl. And when I got to the house, they finally let me in the house, and there was a bedridden woman. She was probably, in her, just a few years younger than my father, in her 80s. And I was trying to explain who I was. And I said, son of Marian Bajda. She goes, Marian! The last she remembered, my father escaped the farm. They got up one morning, and this troublemaking Polish soldier had escaped. My father decided that he and his friend, they didn't want to be working on this butcher farm where they're helping the German army. We need to get back and we need to fight for the Polish army. They escaped. The last she knew, he escaped. Now, whatever many years later, 70, 80 years later, there was a knock on the door and it was his son. And for 1 hour, she just spoke nonstop German. I have no idea what she was saying. Tears coming out. She gave me a handful of photos. I finally went on my way and, continued my journey, but I just wish I knew half of what she was telling me. But it was just one of the many things that happened in this whole journey that to me was just so fascinating. I wanted to leave because I wanted to see the river that my father said he swam across. So I made it to the Morava River. My father and 2 others left at midnight. They escaped the farm at midnight. They got to this river, and there was a patrol guarding, making sure nobody crosses, because the other side of that river is Slovakia. So when my father got to the river, it was, full moon, 1 o'clock in the morning, whatever, And their third accomplice said, I can't swim. So they slept through the night, got up the next morning, made a raft out of, reeds, went across that river, and when they're almost to the other side, in the middle of the night, this is the following night, this current was so strong, it took them downriver, the raft fell apart. They struggled, they finally made it to the other side, and they made it to Slovakia. And they spent the next month or so hiking up north, trying to make their way back to Poland. The thought was, let's go back to Bochnia, let's go to Poland, we'll hide, we'll figure out a way to join the Polish army. That was their thinking. And this is a picture, again, when I tried to retrace the steps, I wanted to see what the countryside was like that they were walking through. And these are the mountains. This is my cousin Michał. And I can't imagine, for as long as they did, how they could trek across this mountainous region with nothing, no maps, no, we have the luxury of walking, whatever. But they managed to go through, for probably 30 days, past the Carpathian Mountains, and they did make it back to their home in Bochnia, where my father hid in the attic. Because if the Germans would see that this young man was back home, they probably would arrest him, and he probably wouldn't go back to Vikendorf. He very likely would have been sent to a concentration camp. So he hid in the attic. While he was in the attic, a friend of his from school named, why is the name escaping me? Archer was a classmate of his. Archer heard that he was home, and Archer went up, and they were plotting how they could join the Polish army. And by this point, the Anders Army was becoming pretty well known. The Anders Army was making a name for themselves. This is 1944. The Anders Army was winning battles in Italy, and the hope was, we have to find a way to join that army. We'll be liberated next. So Archer and my dad plotted a trip to join the Anders Army. That's kind of outrageous, actually. Let me see if I could use the pointer. If I can show you. So they're sitting in the attic. I can't imagine how they came up with this plan, but they thought, okay, we're in southern Poland, which is, they're somewhere around here. We're going to go through Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey. We're going to make our way all through northern Africa. And when we get to Palestine, we'll take a ship and we'll go over here and join the Polish army. Wow. Pretty simple, right? The thought being, it's easier than if you go this way, you're going right in very dangerous territory. So their thought is, we'll take this roundabout way. And sure enough, they left early one morning to go on this venture. And they made it through, and this is all mountains, they made it through Slovakia. They made it through Hungary. They're in Romania. They're thinking they're home free. They saw a farm to try to get some, maybe get some help, get some food. The farmer said, hold on, 5 minutes. 5 minutes went by, 10 minutes went by. They thought, we better get out of here. Then there was the Romanian soldiers arrested them. Romania was neutral. They had just turned over. They're now supporting the Russians, which were our allies. But these Romanian soldiers thought that my father and Archer were spies for Hungary, who was on the other side. So they were sent to a Romanian prison of war camp in the southern part of Romania, a town called Pitești. 150 soldiers in this prison of war camp. My father and Archer, the only two civilians, the only two Poles. Most of them were Hungarian soldiers. There was also some Polish soldiers. There was only 2 individuals in that whole camp who were trying to escape. It was the 2 Poles. First time they didn't make it. They were gone for a few days. They made it for a few days. They were being hidden by some Polish people in the community. And they learned that the soldiers came and said, we think you have them. If they don't come back, you're all going to face hardship. So my father and his friends said, okay, we'll go back. But they went back in style. they got their friends in Romania to get a big carriage, give them a fancy, and they were acting like celebrities. They came back into the camp as if they were celebrities. Commandant didn't like that. On the third attempt, they did make it. They made it out of the prison camp with help from an old guard. It's pretty crazy. You got to read the book, you know, the story. But it's pretty impressive, the resourcefulness that they used, you know, to make all this happen. So they did ultimately make it to Romania. Now let me get back to what was happening and why they wanted so bad to join this Andrews Army. So this here is Monte Cassino. Monte Cassino is a very famous place where a very famous battle occurred. The line up on top, that's an abbey. That's a very famous abbey, the Monte Cassino Abbey. And the line that's up there was being held by the Germans. That was allowing Germany to hold Italy. As long as they could hold that line, then Germany or Italy was pretty much intact with the Germans. The Allies in 1944 made 3 attempts to scale that mountain, to take that abbey, so that they could begin the liberation of Italy. All 3 attempts failed. Finally, in May of 1944, Anders was chosen. We want you to lead your Polish army on the 4th attempt to try to take that abbey. It took 2 days, hand-to-hand combat, May 17th and May 18th. My Uncle Stephen was in the battle. Early on the morning of May 18th, they were shocked that there was no return fire. They went up and they realized the Germans had retreated. The army had overtaken the Germans, and that began the liberation of Italy. Getting Monte Cassino on that day, May 18th, which is a very historical day, led to the liberation of Italy, which, you know, battle after battle occurred from that point forward. So my father, he knew this. They wanted to join this army. It was very important for them to join this army. And this is red poppy. On the morning of May 18th, to commemorate the victory at Monte Cassino, there were 2 Poles who wrote a song to commemorate the victory. It was a battle song. And without getting into the whole song, it said, "The poppies of Monte Cassino will remain forever red, because rather than drinking dew, they drank from Polish blood." There was over 1,000 soldiers that were killed in that battle. So that's a little bit. You hear about Monte Cassino. There's a lot about the information here. That's a little bit about the Monte Cassino. So my father, on their trek, and I kind of jumped ahead a little bit. This is Romania, the Romanian countryside of Transylvania, where my father was captured. They were actually held in a castle in Transylvania before they were sent to the prison in Protesti. And when they finally got out of that prison, they were aided with the help of, man, that wasn't exactly Polish underground, it was more like a Polish mafia, who actually helped them in this town. And this is a cellar where my father was held, was being hidden. My father knew the address of this cellar. So when I was in, and this is actually in Bucharest. They made their way, they went from Protesti to Bucharest. I went to Bucharest, and now it's a very fancy restaurant. And the gentleman, he knew why we were there. He gave us the first-class treatment. We have beautiful wine dinner, and I told him that my father was there. He was interested in the history. When I showed my father the picture, I said, "Is this where you guys, that mafia was hiding you?" He said, "Yeah, but it didn't quite look like that when we were there." He remembered those arch ceilings, that was there. But they ultimately did make their way out of. Bucharest. They made their way back to Poland. But by this time, Germany had surrendered. Germany had surrendered, but the war was not over, because all the Poles knew that it was now Russia who was occupying their land. And the thought was, we need to liberate our Poland from Russia. Plus, the Allies were still fighting Japan in the Pacific, but the Poles, every Polish officer did not look, just the Germany surrender was not the end of the war to them. So they still wanted to continue, and the word was that Anders, who was now in Italy, with all the victorious battles, was assembling a Polish army. Young Polish men from all over Europe were going into northern Italy in the town of Ancona to join this army. And my father and Arthur were two of them who made it. On the way there, my father had a strong sense that his brother, Stefan, he just felt he was near. He felt that he was somehow fighting for Poland. He had a strong sense. And every time they came to a Polish cemetery, this is a cemetery near Ancona, this is nothing but Polish soldiers. This is a Polish cemetery. And all around Italy, you'll see cemeteries with nothing but Polish grave markers. My father would stop at every cemetery, walk up and down with angst, wondering if he would see the name of his brother. He was continually thinking, I gotta find Stefan. My father was sent to an officer school. They saw his potential, and they sent him to an officer school to he became a lieutenant. And while he was at the train station, he heard a familiar voice, and he knew it was his brother Stefan. He was 15 years old when he last saw Stefan, when Stefan left them to join the army. 6 years later, he said he walked up to him, and Stefan just looked at him and froze, like he didn't know who it was, like he was seeing a ghost. I said, what'd you say to him? He said, I said, hi, Stefan. And Stefan, I guess, just about fainted. And there's my father on the left with Stefan on the right. They spent 6 months together in officer school. The stories of the time they spent together were wonderful. Stefan they would never see one another again. Stefan married an Italian woman. He couldn't go to England after the war. There was, long story short, some Italian women were marrying Poles just to get out of Italy. By the time they got to England, they would go their own ways. So Stefan did end up going to Argentina, where he lived. He died at a fairly young age, but the 6 months that they spent together, it just sounded like it was a beautiful time that they were able to spend together. So I'm going to kind of fast forward here a little bit and just kind of explain how I got through all this. So unfortunately, the Poles learned very soon we're not going to liberate Poland. While my father and Stefan were together, they couldn't even contact their family in Poland to say we're okay. Because if they did, letters would have been intercepted by the Russians. The family would have been treated bad, maybe arrested, so they couldn't even let their own family members know we're okay. Soon the Yalta Agreement came out, and unfortunately Stalin convinced both Roosevelt and Churchill that he would take care of all the Eastern European countries. He would make sure there's free elections. He would invest in the infrastructure, and we all know what happened. Anders never went back. Had he gone back, he would have been executed. Anders tried to warn Churchill, and I'll tell you a little bit later how I know some of this. Anders tried to warn him, but Stalin said Anders is a troublemaker, this and that. Obviously, Roosevelt and Churchill made a mistake that we paid for a long time. But my father did go to Italy. He was in a little town in the northern part of Italy where the English, they would have dances. And all the English girls would be there meeting the Polish soldiers. My mother snuck out of the house because she had a strict uncle, said, you're not going to go to a dance with Polish soldiers, and they're not even, and they're Catholic on top of that. They snuck out of the house, and my father and my mother on the left, that's where they met. That's why I'm here today. And that's my Uncle Edward and my Aunt Pauline next to them, who stayed in England. So we did come to America in 1956 on the Britannic. And I'm just going to go through a few photos fairly quick, just to explain how I have some of these posters here. So, I grew up knowing nothing about my father's story. It was only about maybe 8 years ago that he finally opened up. And once he started, he didn't stop. To the point that I said, wow, I have to write, I have to put this on paper. I wrote the book. When I got the book written, it somehow got in the hands of Poland's ambassador to America. And he invited us to the Polish embassy for Constitution Day. And there he is, Piotr Wilczek. He was, all these people were waiting to meet him. He kept us in, he was so fascinated with the story. The line, they had to wonder, who are we? You know? And we're in his office for an hour. And he said, I have to, he goes, this story's amazing. He goes, I got to call somebody. He called Anna Maria Anders, who was at the time Poland's Secretary of State. He said, I have an amazing story for you. I want you to visit Cleveland. I want you to meet this gentleman and his son and help tell the story of the Trail of Hope. So he arranged for her to come to Cleveland, which she did. And it was a weekend of parties. There she is, and we're actually playing music of, her mother was a famous movie star, beautiful woman, famous movie star. And she was playing, you know, we were on the radio, they were playing some of her mother's music. And we did a lot. There's a speech, there's Marcy Kaptur, gave a talk at the garden, the Polish Cultural Garden. We had a lot of things going on, and we did party. There's my dad up at the top, and Anna Maria's in there somewhere. Bottom line, we became very good friends with Anna Maria Anders, the general's daughter. My father and I were on TV, and my father shared with me this compass. I said, what is this compass? He talked a Romanian prison guard into giving him this compass, which they used to help them escape. This prison guard, I'm sure, you know, I can see our demographic here. You all remember Hogan's Heroes, right? He said this prison guard was kind of like a Sergeant Schultz, you know. So he talked this prison guard into giving him this compass, which he used to escape. And when we were invited to Poland to be a part, and Italy, to be a part of all these ceremonies to recognize the 75-year anniversary of the Anders Army victory at Monte Cassino. When we got there, my father said to Anna Maria, I have a gift for you. He gave her that compass. This is at a beautiful restaurant in Poland, after a few bottles of wine. And with that compass was a note that said, this compass guided me on a journey to join your father's army. Now I give it to you for your journey in life. So that was the note that went with that compass. I'm almost done. And there we are. This is in front of the monument that recognizes the victory at Monte Cassino. Anna Maria literally became almost like a sister to me. We text pretty regularly. She doesn't call my dad your dad. She says, how's dad? I mean, that's literally, you know, the connection that we've established. This is my father meeting President Duda, Polish President Duda, as part of the ceremony. And then I think the last thing I have here is the speech that Anna Maria gave. This is in Monte Cassino, it's a beautiful speech, and she actually gave it in 3 languages. And the gist of the speech was, my father would be so proud and honored today to know that his daughter is speaking for a free Poland with the presidents of both Poland and Italy present. And behind them, there's 1,117 grave markers, all of Polish soldiers who died in the battle. And there was a scout member at every one of the grave markers on the battle. And I think I have just one more. No, that's it. But General Anders is buried there. As I said, he could not go back to Poland. His wish was to be buried with the soldiers at Monte Cassino, and her mother is also buried in this same place. So I see we're at about 50 minutes. Instead, I try to keep it at about 45, so I think we did pretty good. So that is my talk. I thank you all for your time, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
How old was Anders when he died?
I saw that good question.
I mean, did he look a...
He lived a pretty long life, and I'll share a little side story with you. Anna Maria told me that she remembers as a little girl, she remembers Churchill coming to the house. And Churchill and her father would smoke cigars, drink whatever, and have a conversation. And when Churchill left, her mother would kind of jokingly say, "Burn that couch." That's how upset she was. I mean, obviously thankful to the British, obviously. But at the same time, disappointed that it turned out the way it did. Because, you know, had we listened and paid more attention and not put the trust in Stalin, you know, things may have turned out quite differently. But I'm not sure the age. I think he was born like in the late 1800s. He was probably about 60. She also remembers her father quite beaten. He was beaten. He was beaten pretty bad. He was a strong man. But he was beaten, tortured pretty bad. So she remembers him, you know, as a strong man, but also, you know, he did suffer. Yep.
You speak the language?
Unfortunately, I don't. No, I don't. Polish was never spoken in my house, you know, because my mother's British. And when I go back, I wish I could speak the language. So unfortunately, I don't. Yes?
Sir, earlier you alluded to Churchill and Roosevelt, the Stalin what he wanted. If you drill down to that a little bit more.
So the Yalta Agreement was actually put together before the end of the war. By that point, they knew we were going to win the war. And the idea is, after the war, how do we prepare for the next, you know, the next step? And there's no doubt, Russia lost more than anybody. Russia lost more people, more soldiers than any other country. So clearly, Russia lost a lot. Now, the unfortunate part is that they didn't, you know, while they lost a lot, and Russians were very instrumental in the defeat of Germany, Stalin also murdered a lot. He murdered many Ukrainians. You know, he starved them. He got rid of many Poles, you know, and it was only when Germany invaded that he turned. So he was also guilty of killing many, including many of his own people. So unfortunately, I think in 1945, the Allies just wanted the war to end. They wanted to be done with this war, this terrible war, and they probably, you know, the Polish soldiers were saying he must have, you know, Stalin must have got them drunk on his finest vodka. I think it was simply the recognition they did give up. Russia did lose a lot. Stalin was an ally. And I think there was hope that maybe he will do what he's saying. Unfortunately, he didn't. Yeah.
But by the time of Yalta, Roosevelt was super sick.
Yeah.
And it was pretty much Churchill against Stalin.
Yeah.
Not so much Churchill and Roosevelt.
That's true. It's true. Now, Churchill did admit quite early he made a mistake. Roosevelt was always smitten with Stalin. That's what I understand. I understand that Roosevelt really did like him, but you're right. Roosevelt at that point was not, you know, he was not in the best of health. That is true. Yeah. Yes?
How did your family wind up in Cleveland?
So, that's a good question. So we were in England, you know, I was 2 years old, and my father, like a lot of Poles, you weren't treated great. You know, even though you were very instrumental, you know, you were welcomed in England, but it's not your home. And America was a land of milk and honey, the land of opportunity. My father knew one person who happened to live, he thought about many places, but he knew one person who we used to work with who lived around Mansfield, the area of Mansfield, the only person we knew. So we got off the boat in New York Harbor, 1956, took a train to Columbus, 3 suitcases was all we had, and his traveler checks got stolen on the train. Lived in with his family for a while around Mansfield. There were a lot of jobs in Elyria, Lorraine. My father was a welder in London. He worked at the Lorraine, so he got a job at the Lorraine shipyards. Came to Elyria. They brought him to the Polish club. He felt at home. So that's how we ended up in Elyria, and he's been here ever since. And he quite frankly, he really does enjoy Elyria. Yes. So, how I got them? Well, that was when the ambassador called Anna Maria Anders after we met with him, and he said, he sent them to me. He said, I want you to help tell our story. Really important that you tell our story. I used to give quite a few book talks. It slowed down with COVID, and I thank you for this opportunity to be here today because I would like to strike it up again. And I'll give y'all just one other, so it's a great opportunity for me to share this information, share these beautiful posters, and we'll leave them up here after if you want to look around. But also I have business cards up here in addition to my books for sale. So if you ever want to reach out to me for talks or anything with any other groups or organizations, I would be happy to do that. And I will give you one more teaser. So a lot of people have told me when I used to give talks, I said, you should make a movie out of this. I did write a screenplay. I'm dusting it off now, and I met with a young gentleman who's now in Los Angeles who said he's going to work with me, give me some look at it. I don't know if it'll happen, but he's convinced me if you want to do this, it's going to happen. That's my hope and dream that one day it can be on the big screen. Yeah. Yes?
Is there a Polish consulate in Cleveland?
No.
No?
No, he's in New York. So they come to Cleveland. I'm actually the president of the Polish American Cultural Center, which, by the way, has a beautiful museum in Slavic Village of Polish American culture. And he was just here recently. We celebrated the 25-year anniversary of our center. But they does come occasionally. And if you're Polish, oftentimes they'll come to our center if they allow voting. So we have different things that we will do with their support. And if you need touch with anybody, I could get you in touch with people. Okay?
I'm a member.
Oh, awesome! By the way, we're having a really fun dance September 21st called the Dojinki.
Okay.
Yeah, so come out to
Okay.
it. We have a polka band coming from Canada.
Okay.
So it's going to be a really fun day.
Where is that going to be?
It's in Slavic Village. It's the Polish American Cultural Center on Lansing Road.
Okay.
Anybody, we're all invited. Yes?
How would you describe the relationship between Poland and Russia today?
Oh,
What time will
I've got family. I have no family members in the United States. They're all in Poland and England. They're nervous about Russia. Very nervous. And for good reason, because Russia, does what they say. They did invade Ukraine, and Poland is next. Poland is right at that border. Now, fortunately, Poland is part of the NATO, thank you. Poland is part of NATO, and the thought being, you invade one, we protect you. Ukraine, unfortunately, isn't. But they're nervous. People, and by the way, people in Poland are very good. If you go to Poland, you would see it's a wonderful country, beautiful scenery, beautiful cities, high quality of life, really high quality. They're not fretting about it, but it's there. And fortunately, the United States is a good ally, is a strong ally. So I don't know that, Poland would have the same fate as Russia, but people are nervous. And I think it is, without getting political, very important that we support Ukraine, because they're the proxy force. It's unfortunate that they are there in this situation. I wish we could do more, but Ukraine, holding that ground is really important. Yes? I'm sorry, I thought I saw a hand. Well, if there are no other questions, I will, I'm sorry, yes.
What time will that dance?
Oh, you did that dance.
I'm putting it in my calendar.
The dance will be September 21st. I believe it's 1 o'clock to 6 o'clock in the afternoon.
Okay.
Yep. And I'd love to see you there.
We do the polka.
I just moved, you know. Do you? Yes, well, this will be your opportunity then. Well, it was a sincere pleasure to be here today, to get a chance to meet you guys and to have such an attentive audience. It really was a sincere pleasure, and once again, I thank you for this opportunity.